Hello and welcome to Macro Matters, the economics and politics podcast from the Aberdeen Standard Investments Research Institute. My name is Paul Diggle, Senior Economist at Aberdeen Standard, and I'm here with my co-host Stephanie Kelly, our Senior Political Economist. Today, it's just the two of us, and we're going to have a discussion first about the US election result and our takeaways a week on from election day, with the result now much clearer than when we recorded our immediate thoughts on the morning after. And then we're going to jump back to this side of the Atlantic and talk about European politics, both what the US election means for Europe, but also how the tectonic plates of European politics themselves are shifting and what's going on the European political scene. But let's start by hearing a segment of President-elect Joe Biden's victory speech.
The people of this nation have spoken. They've delivered us a clear victory, a convincing victory, a victory for we the people. We've won with the most votes ever cast from presidential ticket in the history of the nation. 74 million.
So that was Joe Biden. And Stephanie, why don't we start by sort of recapping what we know, what we still don't know a week on from the election itself?
Sure, yeah, of course. I mean, what we know so far is that Joe Biden looks set to win the presidency. It's been announced by the major news networks. It hasn't been officially confirmed by the governing agency. There is obviously some legal uncertainty created by the Trump campaign and indeed supported by the Republican Party to try to take legal action on the basis of claims that some of the votes were misrepresented and there was some kind of issues in terms of transparency and validity of votes. Now, while that's making a lot of headlines, understandably, I think it doesn't change what we know. What we know is that President-elect Biden is the appropriate term for Joe Biden at the moment because he has won, it appears, the number of states and then some for what he needs to win the US Electoral College, which is what is required to become the next president. So I think that's what we know quite comfortably.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into this issue of the legal challenges maybe a little bit later, but perhaps with the benefit of a week and more results and votes actually counted, we can maybe take a second swipe at this issue of polling versus reality. On the morning after, when we recorded our sort of bleary-eyed thoughts, it looked like an enormous polling error. A week on, that margin, that difference between the sort of the polling lead that Biden had and then the actual popular vote lead he had has shrunk. It's still meaningful, but it's shrunk. So, a week on, was this a giant polling error still, or has it actually conformed with a lot of those pre-election predictions?
To be honest, it is still quite a miss, both in terms of it looks like at the national level. I mean, especially when you consider, the average going in was about 9 percentage points lead nationally. It's looking like it'll be somewhere in the 3 to 4 percentage points range at the moment, although I haven't checked the latest figures today. But, I guess it's one of those things where when the candidate who is favoured in the polls wins, then people are kind of willing to, I guess, bat away any issues about polling. But the reality is that he won by significantly less at the national level than polls suggested. But more importantly, from the perspective of the outcome, it was much tighter in key swing states than the polls suggested. And there you're talking about misses in places like Wisconsin and Michigan to a degree, where, we actually saw quite significant polling misses. They weren't enough to bring Biden kind of away from the victory spot, but they certainly tested it a little bit more and made that election kind of vote counting period much, much more tenuous and challenging. For example, it wasn't apparent on the night how Biden had done in these key swing states, which with a big, strong vote margin, you might have known a little bit earlier rather than what happened, which was we ended up waiting until kind of Friday and even Saturday before it became really kind of clearly accepted wisdom that Biden was going to win the presidency.
Yeah, I suppose that wait and that both that red mirage and then blue shift in the votes, I think, is what a lot of people went on a sort of huge emotional roller coaster as the results came in, of course. But why don't we talk about these legal challenges then? Because the fact that it did come down to sort of tens of thousands of votes in the end in a few of the key swing states has allowed or perhaps encouraged President Trump to pursue these legal challenges. Are we expecting much to come from them? Are they genuine challenges that could yet change the result, or are they a sideshow at this point?
I mean, I say this with some caution, of course. I mean, if you had to pick one bucket to put them in, I'd probably put them into more of the sideshow bucket, just because the kind of allegations that the Trump administration are making about kind of voter fraud were ones that they kind of presaged well in advance of this election over Twitter. And, you know, just because there are Republican leaders who aren't disagreeing with Trump's approach or are saying that he has the right to explore his legal options isn't the same as saying that there is a genuine chance that this can change the outcome. And I think an important difference maybe to the 2000 experience where there was a contested election between Bush and Gore is that in that case, it was Florida that was kind of the key state, and you know, whoever won the president won or didn't win on the basis of that state. In this case, it looks like Biden has won a number of states. Looks like he could end up with 306 electoral votes, which means he's quite comfortably over the margin. So unless there is some kind of systemic, you know, issue with voting irregularities in the United States, which has never been the case in history before, and there's no real evidence to suggest that it is the case now, it's very hard to see how this legal pursuit kind of changes the outcome in terms of who ends up as president. What it can do, though, I think in the meantime, is muddy the waters between Republicans and Democrats at a time where it looks like they're going to need to try to work together in the next in the next presidency, in the next session of Congress, because it looks at this stage, and maybe this is where we get to what we don't know, but it looks at this stage like the Republicans are likely to hold on to a majority in the Senate.
Yeah, so let's get into the to the Senate, and then maybe that's our way into fiscal issues as well and the fiscal outlook. But as you say, Steph, it all the Senate is still up for grabs one way or the other. And so what are we waiting for there? Why is the Senate result not yet clear? And when are we going to know it?
So the big unknown is Georgia. So Georgia had 2 Senate seats up for election. One was a special election and one was kind of a regular Senate election. And both of those now have to go to runoff for different reasons, but the long and the short of it is there's going to be a runoff election on the 5th of January, and we won't know until after the 5th of January whether it's Republicans who end up with a majority or whether it's Democrats. At the moment, the margin is 48-48 with 2 states still to call. One is Alaska, which is going to be Republican, and one is North Carolina from memory, and that looks likely to go Republican as well. So it really is for Democrats hoping to take a majority in the Senate. Georgia is really their last shout. Now, we think, and I think common wisdom at the moment is that, you know, it's the Republican state to lose in a way, because there's just a structural conservatism in Georgia. And then the Georgia Senate races, although the candidates didn't do well enough to actually win on the first round, the Republicans slightly overperformed and Democrats slightly underperformed on the night. And so both of those things together mean that the Republicans go in with an advantage, but we still give the Democrats about a 30% chance of winning those 2 seats. And I think it is likely that it's a case of both seats going to one party rather than having one seat go to one party and one seat going to another. That doesn't tend to happen in these cases.
And I imagine the campaigning ahead of those Georgia runoffs is going to be intense, and the sort of the money poured into those
Absolutely.
2 seats, and then how involved Biden himself is in that campaign is maybe an interesting issue. But of course, the reason they're so important is because they are going to decide control of the Senate one way or the other, and therefore a lot of President-elect Biden's ability to pass fiscal policy. So where are we in terms of the fiscal outlook that we are expecting under this sort of tentative baseline of a split Congress, but with Biden in the presidency?
So where we sit with, if this is the outcome, the expectation is that fiscal policy will be really significantly constrained, particularly compared to if the Democrats manage to pull off the 2 seats in Georgia such that they have a majority, because in the United States, if you've got 50 seats in the Senate and you also have the presidency, then the vice president becomes the tie-breaking vote. So in this case, 50 counts as a majority for the Democrats. So relative to that, the expectation is that the path for fiscal policy is challenging. We do know that McConnell and Biden have a decent working relationship, but Republicans are really unlikely to sign up to anything that implies tax increases and anything that implies increasing deficit financing. And so those two things are basically going to put an end to many, if not, most of the Biden administration's priorities. So think of, any of the kind of expansion of healthcare and expansion of education spending. Spending in general is hard to do if you can neither finance it through your deficit expansion or through tax rises. So it's a much more challenging environment in that respect. The one area where we expect a little bit of movement is just early on, the COVID relief package that failed to get passed before the election. We expect some form of COVID relief package to be passed after the lame duck session, maybe during, but again, our contacts in DC suggest that that's less likely. But in the next couple of months, so maybe kind of to the end of Q1, we would expect at some point in that time we get a COVID relief bill that is obviously has to be bipartisan, but is maybe in the realm of kind of $500 to $1 trillion. There's a lot of uncertainty. We're starting out with a new administration. The politics are going to be very, complex as it is, without then also having to deal with the legal controversy that's sowing discontent between the two parties at the moment. But we do expect that some kind of limited, COVID deal, which in the context of what was being proposed by Democrats, which was kind of $2.3 trillion plus, it's a really kind of, to us, quite a significantly smaller package. And then beyond that kind of relief package, traditional fiscal policy we expect to be in gridlock basically for at least the 2 years to the next midterms, and then depending on the outcome, the 2 years following that.
So maybe a final topic for this segment is to think a little bit about what Biden's foreign policy would look like, and this is our sort of way into Europe in the second segment as well. But I think there's two areas that I'm sort of interested in. One is what he does vis-a-vis China, obviously a big focus of US foreign policy for the past 4 years. And then it's the state of the US-European relationship as well. What are you looking for here, Steph?
So I think when it comes to the foreign and trade policy element of the relationship, I think it is potentially quite different than under Trump. And in particular, look, China is a source of concern for both Democrats and Republicans. We don't expect a massive improvement in the relationship between the US and China in the coming years under Biden. We do expect fewer tweets about tariff decisions. We expect more kind of consistency and a more strategic approach to US-China relations. But does that mean tariffs come down? I don't necessarily think so. Does that mean that you end up with non-tariff barriers being lowered? Absolutely not. In particular, I think non-tariff barriers have been escalating in the last couple of years, actually as a result of bipartisan efforts from Congress rather than necessarily from the White House. And I expect that to continue. And then really the benefit of this, I think, from a geopolitical stability perspective, is that Biden is a political multilateralist. He's not necessarily an economic multilateralist, but he believes in the benefit of political agreements across country, working with different regions, working with your allies. And he's kind of stressed the importance of the relationship between the US and Europe as a crucial kind of relationship that he wants to mend after 4 years of the Trump administration, which had a much more fractious relationship with Europe. And I think that has knock-on implications, for Europe itself, but also for the overall geopolitical stability that we get under the Biden presidency. which is, I think, positive for investors, because at the very least, it reduces the overall sense of risk and unpredictability that the Trump administration's trade policy kind of brought to bear on, particularly, as you saw, risk assets in the US and indeed in countries affected by US trade policy decisions over the last 4 years.
Yeah, so as a Europe watcher myself, on the US-European relationship, I suppose things I'm watching for are that multilateralism, that mending of the Atlantic alliance, which potentially is easily done. I mean, it's sort of positive words about the value of the North Atlantic alliance in the first few days of the administration. I would think the UK is going to have a much more successful COP26 now with President Biden in attendance rather than President Trump. Trade-wise, I also think it's very complicated on the trade front. The Boeing Airbus trade dispute, which obviously isn't a specific part of President Trump's trade war, it predates that, is still very much ongoing. Europe's about to instigate a digital service tax potentially, which I think any US administration doesn't really like. And then, you'll have lots of thoughts on this too, Steph, but it seems to me like the US's role in Brexit gets quite interesting under President Biden. To put it in very crude terms, it's as if the US has essentially swapped sides from the UK to Europe, and in sort of where it's throwing its support behind the Brexit process. And you could imagine under Biden that his first port of call when he wants to talk to a European leader is no longer the UK, and maybe it's Germany or France, maybe it's even Ireland.
Well, I was going to say there's that clip that's going around at the moment of the BBC trying to get Biden to give them a quote and saying kind of, oh, Biden, and him saying, oh, you're the BBC? No, I'm Irish. So I think you're totally right. I think that's a clear area where there's a shift in terms of kind of the not explicit but implicit political allegiances, and it, to your point, I think it has quite a significant bearing on the calculations that the UK government has to make in terms of the Brexit negotiations, and specifically their willingness to give on some areas and not others. I don't think it changes the overall likelihood significantly that you get a deal or you don't, because we've already think that a Brexit deal is more likely than not, but it probably at the margin helps. And then when it comes to trade policy with Europe, I think you're right to say it's a little bit complicated. My view on this will be, it's not that, allies can take trade issues with each other to the World Trade Organization. It happens every day. It's quite a normal kind of element. It happened under the Obama administration. The difference is, A, going through the traditional channels of the World Trade Organization, which all the countries have signed up to, and B, which is related to that, it's conforming to, political norms and expectations of your allies, which means, it's like your friends. You can have arguments with your friends, but underlying it, your friends. And so there's less of a threat to any individual argument. I think the challenge with the Trump administration was it really threw up into the air, is this EU-US relationship as prized as it was? Is it as strong as it was? What does it mean if it's not? And it's a very different approach than if there's an individual trade issue and, the US or the EU goes to the World Trade Organization and it gets assessed by the World Trade Organization. That's just a very different environment. And it's a much more predictable one for investors to understand how things work and what's normal and what's not.
Brilliant. Well, we're just going to take a little break and we'll be right back digging into European politics.
Mr. Biden, a quick word for the BBC.
The BBC, I'm Irish.
So we're back, and obviously we've just talked a lot about the impact of the US election in terms of both kind of the overall growth outlook, but importantly, kind of linking into this question of, in the past, we've taken US-EU friendship for granted. The last 4 years have tested that a little bit, and now we're coming through. But I think Europe is one of those areas that maybe at the moment has been flying a little bit under the radar with all the noise about Brexit and about the US elections. But nonetheless, I think is a really important one that we need to understand, and is obviously a huge element of economic growth in the world, and in addition to that is an important political and geopolitical player. So I think it's useful for us to step back from the political noise of the election and Brexit for a little bit, and maybe dig in a little bit more to the EU side of things, which sometimes I'm conscious, particularly in English speaking media, we can kind of tend towards focusing on those English speaking, the UK and the US. So Paul, maybe let's talk about Europe, and in particular the state of play at the moment. It seems as though COVID cases are rising in Europe, and maybe faster than in other places. I mean, how are you seeing the kind of COVID growth nexus playing out at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a somewhat depressing answer, I think. Europe's clearly in the throes of a second wave. Comparing it to the first wave is fairly difficult because the first wave was so undermeasured, but it's maybe slightly less severe, but only slightly. There's been a huge rise in positive cases, and that's with a lag is also now translating into hospitalizations and deaths as well. And that in turn has then meant an increase in lockdown restrictions on continental Europe and in the UK as well, as we know well. And this previous expectation that I think a lot of economists and market participants had, which was that lockdowns would remain regional rather than national, and they would never quite reach the stringency that they got to in the first wave in the spring. That's really starting to be challenged because now we have a number of national lockdowns, and I think the tightening in stringency to where we are now, sort of early November, is not done. I would look out for things like across the continent, all hospitality settings moving to takeaway only. There's a clear question about whether universities will return after the Christmas break. So there's potentially, vaccine news notwithstanding, scope for lockdown stringency to increase. And then as you say, that the nexus of all that with activity means that a lot of the high frequency European economic data is really weakening now and starting to give way in the face of this second wave and renewed lockdowns. So we've spoken on the podcast before about tracking daily big data, and a lot of that is starting to dip now, suggesting that people are leaving the house less, going to shops less, in the workplace less. And I would expect it to start showing in the more traditional data, things like the Q4 GDP print, which potentially is going to show a number of European economies back in contraction. So unfortunately, we're in the territory of talking about that old curse of the European economy, which is the double dip recession. And I think that's unfortunately sort of the stage we've got to over the winter.
So that's quite obviously, as you say, maybe a little bit of a bleak outlook in terms of the health outcomes at the very least, and likely economic activity. I mean, where does policy play into this? I mean, is it a case that, governments are doing what they can, but it just won't be enough? And then how do you see the kind of recovery fund also playing into this? Or, does it have an important role? Obviously, it was a really big deal when it was announced, but actually, in reality, do you expect that to be helpful at the margin? Or how do you see that kind of playing into the policy response overall?
Yeah, those are really important questions. And one of the bits of better news on Europe is that, generally speaking, the policy response, both fiscal and monetary, has been pretty decent, certainly much better than it could have been, or that Europe has a reputation of sort of under-delivering on both monetary and fiscal policy. And I don't think that's happened this time around. So maybe just to tick off monetary policy first, it's highly likely that the European Central Bank is going to increase further its quantitative easing program come December, and that's fairly good news. It means things like Italian sovereign debt yields remain fairly well supported by this central bank backstop, and sort of things like potential funding pressures and debt runs are not really where we are in the conversation with Europe at the moment. And then on the fiscal front, the recovery fund, for all its drawbacks, and there are a number of important drawbacks that we could potentially talk about, is a decent concerted piece of pan-European policy making, probably more important in its symbolism than its actual practical implementation. And then national level fiscal policy as well has actually remained supportive. And in the European national budgets that a lot of countries submitted to the Commission in the past few weeks, there's no fiscal tightening planned in 2021. So the European fiscal rules remain de facto suspended. And that is Europe seemingly learning the lessons of the financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis, where a premature retightening of fiscal policy was a big part of why Europe went down the route of double dip recession and experiencing a sovereign debt crisis. That's not happening this time around. Things like the short-time work schemes, Kurzarbeit in Germany and elsewhere, are generally being extended. Now, the reason they're being extended is because Europe's in a second wave and going into renewed lockdown. So those support measures, unfortunately, have to remain in place. But the fact that there is political willingness to, I think, keep the fiscal taps open is probably a good thing. But Steph, we've spoken a lot about the sort of the benefits, but also the drawbacks of the recovery fund. And I know there are a number of sticking points at the moment to the timely disbursement of the recovery fund money. How concerned are we getting that the recovery fund is actually off track for actually handing out this money?
So it's kind of interesting because I think the recovery fund, in some ways, as much as it has represented political progress, it has also underscored the political issues that exist in Europe in a longer term perspective. It kind of says, if you're wondering what the political issues in Europe are, look at the recovery fund, because to me they're kind of twofold. One is the really traditional, and we've talked about this before on this podcast, the really traditional kind of north-south divide, this perspective about, do you share risk first in order to reduce it across the region, or do you reduce your risk so that then it's fairer to share risk, right? And that's the never-ending debate that takes place between the North and the South. And we saw play out in the construction of the recovery fund, where the big debate was, how big do we make it? What is the proportion of grants versus loans? But the second kind of, I think, really big, potentially existential question for Europe is a grouping that was, the EU is a grouping that was based off of kind of democratic principles in the wake of World War II. And so, I think the history matters here, because one element that it's having to deal with is, what do you do when democracies that are part of this union start to err towards less democratic values and start to replicate some elements of what would be considered not a democracy. And here specifically, I'm talking about Hungary, where there is growing concern in Brussels regarding changes to rule of law in that country, which are kind of well documented legally. Now, it's not my view one way or another as to whether it is or is not, but the point is that that's what the debate is that's going on in Brussels. And there is now in the Recovery Fund a kind of big debate going on about the importance of rule of law as one of the kind of contingencies for getting access to the funds. And this is causing, I think, more drama than was expected, because traditionally speaking, Hungary and Poland and the eastern states don't tend to be as strong of a kind of political bloc as the kind of traditional German Franco axis, right? So Germany and France tend to be the driving forces. You do get a fair bit of, disagreement often from Italy on issues related to fiscal stuff, but what's unusual here is actually the growing protestations from Hungary in particular, but also Poland, with regards to how you kind of legally define what is a breach of the rule of law conditions of the recovery fund. In terms of how concerned, I would say quite concerned at this point. It does seem to be something that is growing in terms of the size of the issue, and it can't see a clear solution to it. It will ultimately come down to clever legal wording to try and get around the issue. I haven't seen a huge amount suggesting that, it will permanently stop the recovery fund, but it could delay it and even, railroad it for a little while. So it's definitely one to watch. And I think more importantly than the short term, what does it mean for the recovery fund? Because we know in Europe, ultimately, they overcome barriers, but it's actually, how do you deal with this issue, which is quite a significant one, about the importance of the rule of law and democracy in a European Union that has changed and now has a number of countries which are pushing the boundaries around what rule of law is and respect for kind of the traditional ethos of democracy. And that's one that I think will play out over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And it's difficult to see how Europe resolves it.
Yeah, I suppose my take here, I mean, I agree with all that. It's that the recovery fund has forced Europe to face up to this question that it had previously been sort of ignoring or punting into the long grass of how does it deal with illiberal democracies or potential non-democracies in its midst. When it was fundamentally founded, as you say, Steph, as a democratic project. And these technicalities of disbursement of the recovery fund is contingent on meeting certain rule of law provisions, which it turns out Hungary and maybe Poland aren't going to meet. This is sort of forcing the crystallization of this potentially existential question, certainly philosophical question about what is Europe if not a union of democracies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe I kind of wonder, Paul, particularly sometimes it's, they have this, like, it's not what you do, it's not what you say, it's what you do, right? And I'm kind of interested when you look at the European Union and maybe more specifically at the Eurozone, because obviously there are kind of specific issues to the Eurozone that are slightly different to the European Union. What do you think the kind of, I guess, the like main long-term challenges are to optimizing the union and the currency union? I mean, what are the things you want to see, and like what are the challenges to those kinds of changes?
Yeah. So obviously in the short term, it's all about the COVID recovery, right? Keep policy stimulative enough until essentially the vaccine escape hatch opens, and try and sort of obviate as much long-term damage as possible. But in the long term, it's back to quite familiar long-term challenges and proposed, albeit very difficult, solutions in Europe. And the first and foremost is boosting the long-term growth path. I mean, if Europe wants to keep populism at bay, if it wants to work off the debt built up from this and the previous two crises, if it just wants to raise the living standards of its population, it has to secure a decent long-term growth rate. And related to that, and sort of challenge number two, is deepening the union, whether it's the political union or the economic union. So once Brexit is eventually over and done with, European policymakers have to turn to the long-term reform agenda, which may mean making the recovery fund permanent or using it as the start of a sort of common debt instrument, and in that way sort of furthering fiscal union, but also completing banking union, completing capital markets union. I mean, I feel like people have been saying those things in Brussels for sort of a decade or so now. And then the final long-term challenge, as I see it, and this is all related, is avoiding Japanification. Everyone thinks that is Europe's eventual fate, that it slumps into a sort of sclerotic growth, sclerotic political path. I worry that actually that's not Europe's fate, because Europe could not sustain Japanification in the way that Japan itself could, right? Europe doesn't have, I think, the cultural and political cohesion to sustain effectively stagnation at a very high level of living standards, which is how I would sort of interpret what's happened in Japan. I mean, as you know, Steph, Europe has a much more should we say vibrant political culture, and that just I don't think can sustain that kind of low growth trap. And so it seems to me it's either reform, boost long-term growth, deepen the union, or it's bust. and we're back to these sort of questions that we talked about 5 or so years ago of Europe, potential breakup in Europe. But what about you, Steph? I mean, from a political perspective, what long-term growths long-term challenges are you watching in Europe?
I think, interestingly, quite similar ones. I mean, it's the politics and the economics in Brussels never far apart. And I think sometimes There's a tendency sometimes for investors to think that, Europe is an economic project and so it should just run more economically efficiently. But to the point you just made, Europe is a political union. The European Union is political. The Eurozone is political. These were all ideas dreamed up by politicians, not economists. And but the challenge you have is while politicians may have dreamt it up, those politicians are still answerable to their kind of sovereign, voter bases. And those voter bases, to your point, aren't necessarily going to put up with, low growth and, disappointing, particularly, let's talk about things voters care about, right? Unemployment, labor market issues. We know that some countries are more at risk of this than others. And we can already see the kind of populist, Eurosceptic, Europhobic kind of tilt that's created, and Italy's a really prime example of that. So I think that's probably my concern. I think Europe is good at muddling through, but I always have this question of like, is it enough to muddle through for the very long term, or is it like enough to muddle through for the next 5 years, and we just keep doing that? And in fairness, it's that kind of like, can it just keep on keeping on? Can it just keep its head above water? Which maybe suggests that you don't get a massive growth breakout or massive improvement in the fundamentals of Europe, but just enough to keep the train on the track. I kind of think, Europe was built by politicians, and if it's going to be dismantled, that will happen because of politicians as well, and underlying that, voter bases. So it's certainly one that I kind of am nervous about. I mean, more short term, I think Brexit is going to be an interesting case in what happens when a member state leaves and what does that look like. And I'm interested as to whether that shifts hearts and minds, because it looks as though the kind of deal that the UK and the EU are negotiating is going to be a very limited free trade agreement that will result in significant economic pain for the UK in particular, and lower long-term potential growth. And maybe that's an exercise in which people who are part of the European infrastructure start to see benefits more so than they currently do. Maybe that can change hearts and minds. But I think it's just too early to tell on that one.
So maybe, Steph, so the final thing we should deal with when we're talking about European politics is next year is a big German election, and it's probably the end of Merkel on the German and European political scene. I think that probably has quite wide-ranging implications of what a post-Merkel Europe looks like. So do we have any runners and riders for her successor? Is Macron her natural successor on the European political scene?
So it's a really good question. And to a degree, it's an unanswered one, because we've seen with Merkel the attempt to kind of start to have a successor in AKK, but that's really not played out as hoped. I mean, Merkel's role in Europe is really quite profound, and her role in German politics has been, so incredibly profound. As much as she has been criticized for certain policy decisions like the refugee crisis and the choices she made in the wake of that, she still is seen, particularly in the wake of COVID, as this really positive political figure. They have this phrase, they call her Mutti, which is like the German for mother, right? So like, it's this really, I think we probably can't, in a way, we can't understate the implications of Merkel leaving, but in another way, it's hard to say what that looks like. It's kind of a funny situation in that regard. One element that I think is kind of interesting is, you mentioned Macron, but I think the challenge Macron has is he has his own election to fight in the next couple of years as well. So you could end up in this really bizarre position where neither Macron nor Merkel are there. Now, it doesn't seem at this point likely, although it's really hard to say. I mean, the French elections still have a few years before they're due, but it does suggest that we're going into a phase where Europe maybe becomes a little bit less certain. I think Ursula von der Leyen has taken a really key role in terms of European messaging, but obviously she's in a different position than kind of a national leadership position. And then I'm not really giving you any firm answers here, but the other big unknown is Europe's relationship with China, I think, is a really interesting one, because Merkel has tended to, she tends to be very kind of keen on dialogue and engagement, but there is growing appetite in Germany and in Europe more broadly for a more hawkish approach to China, which you can see she's already coming under a bit of pressure for, which we've seen in a couple of the recent issues that have gone on between China and Europe, and particularly to your point earlier about illiberal democracies and how do you deal with them, China creates a real issue for Europe because of its, Europe is increasingly going on this sustainability and, human rights kind of track. And in the meantime, China is not kind of maybe keeping up with Europe's desired standards. So that's, I think, definitely one to watch in a post-Merkel world where you could see a more hawkish tilt to dealing with China. But who that ends up being, I think, is still very much in question.
I think we could do a whole episode on sort of Merkel's legacy and a post-Merkel, what a post-Merkel Europe looks like. I mean, I think this reputation she has of caution and prudence probably doesn't actually stand up to some of the things she's done. Things like being a figurehead for Europe post-financial crisis, big, brave decisions like phasing out nuclear power or letting in 1 million asylum seekers to Germany, or the huge fiscal expansion that we were speaking about earlier that she's got behind during the coronavirus crisis. And my other thought is the fact that we don't know who her successor is. And there's been this sort of struggle within both the CDU and German politics to find a successor. It's precisely because she was so dominant for so long that there's no sort of alternate figure that has emerged. But yeah, for my money, we should be thinking of Macron as probably that natural successor, albeit, as you rightly say, Steph, he's got his own challenges at home.
Yeah, if he can be re-elected, I guess, which is always, French politics is always a fun one. Again, when we could probably do a whole episode on. But I think that was, we really made it around the world there in terms of talking about the US, its relationship with China, the relationship with Europe, and then Europe's, relationship in a way with itself, which is in some ways the most tenuous and uncertain relationship that we kind of are tracking. And I know that we'll probably have many more episodes where we talk about these issues, both in terms of, very short-term, high-risk events. And clearly we've mentioned the role of Hungary in terms of approving the recovery fund, definitely one to watch. And then going forward as the Brexit negotiations play out, and indeed as the coronavirus crisis and hopefully recovery also plays out through 2021. Thank you so much for listening to all of our listeners. We really appreciate it. There's been great uptake to the podcast, which has been fantastic. We'll be back again next week where Paul is going to be talking all things China, and we're going to have a special guest on the show for that. Until then, thanks very much.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.